At my mother-in-law's lavish birthday party, there wasn't a single chair for me. My husband, he just laughed. They thought they were humiliating me, that they could easily push me out of their lives. But there was one thing they didn't know. The wife they looked down on was the only one who could actually afford the entire party. If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Let me know what you think. My name is Charlotte Smith, and this is the story of how I canceled so much more than just a dinner party. The silence in our apartment was my design. It was a precise, calculated quiet born from triple-paned glass, sound-dampening insulation, and walls angled just so. Here, on the 52nd floor overlooking the vast, steely gray of Lake Michigan, the chaos of Chicago was a muted spectacle, a silent film. My world was one of controlled frequencies and predictable reverberations. On my screen, the acoustic modeling for the new Soul Symphony Hall glowed a complex cathedral of numbers and light. I was shaping the way 1,000 people would experience a single, perfect note. It was logical. It was clean. It was a world I had built myself. The chime of the elevator in our private vestibule was the first discordant sound, then the click of the door, and Julian was home. He didn't just bring himself into a room. He brought his entire lineage with him. He carried the metaphorical weight of Charleston, South Carolina on his shoulders, a humid, heavy scent of gardenias, old money, and unspoken obligations. "Hey, Charlie," he said, his voice trying for a lightness it couldn't quite achieve. He loosened the knot of his silk tie, the fabric whispering in the quiet. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection a ghost against the skyline. "Hey," I answered, not looking up from the blueprint. "Tough day." "The usual," he sighed. He was quiet for a moment, the silence between us now, his not mine. It was thicker somehow, uncomfortable. "So," Mom called. I kept my eyes on the screen, my fingers tracing the arc of a proscenium. "Oh, her birthday," he said, finally turning to face me. "The big one. 65. She's decided she wants to celebrate it. Properly." I finally looked at him. Julian was handsome in that effortless way people are when they've never had an awkward phase. But tonight there were fine lines of tension around his eyes, a tightness in his jaw that even the perfect lighting of our apartment couldn't soften. "Properly," I asked, a small smile playing on my lips. "And what does a proper Thorn celebration entail this year, shutting down the historic district for a parade?" He managed a weak smile back, close, a week, at Athelgard in Big Sur. He said the name as if it were a benediction. An ultra-exclusive private resort in California, a place where the 1% went to feel rustic. He was trying to frame it as a gift, a grand vacation. But his tone was that of a man delivering a summons. My mind unbidden spooled back 5 years, back to the TEDx stage in Austin. I was a relative unknown, then a woman with fiery red hair and a passion for something most people found bafflingly obscure. My talk was called The Architecture of Silence. I'd argued that the spaces between sounds were just as important as the sounds themselves. After, in the noisy reception, he had found me, Julian Thorn. He was different from the other men who had approached me. He didn't try to impress me with his own accomplishments. He listened. "You don't just build spaces," he'd said, his voice a low, warm hum that cut through the chatter. "You build experiences. You shape emotion." He had actually understood. He was so different from the polished, pre-approved Charleston debutantes he'd grown up with, and I was a girl from Bend, Oregon, who had put herself through grad school by waiting tables. I fell for his warmth, his intelligence, his promise of a partnership of equals. Then came the first trip to Charleston, to the Thorn ancestral home. The house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum to its own importance, suffocating in the humid air, the portraits of stern-faced ancestors watching from every wall. And there was Genevieve, his mother, dripping in heirloom pearls, her smile as thin as a razor wire. She'd taken my hand, her touch cool and dry. Charlotte, she'd purred, her eyes scanning my simple black dress as if it were a science experiment. "Julian has told us so much about your work." She'd paused, letting the word hang in the air. Architectural acoustics, how wonderfully specific. She'd tilted her head, the smile never wavering. "You must be very clever to have made a career from something so niche." It wasn't a compliment. It was a classification. She dismissed my entire life's work, my company, my passion as a quaint, curious hobby. And Julian standing beside me had just smiled, a silent, helpless bystander. Back in the present, the memory made my stomach clench. "Big Sir sounds lovely," I said, my voice carefully neutral. Julian's relief was a physical thing. His shoulders slumped, the tension visibly draining from his face. It was too much relief. "It will be," he said a little too brightly. He walked over and kissed the top of my head. "Of course you'll handle the event logistics with Mom's planner. You have such a talent for making things seamless." And there it was, that familiar dull thud in my gut. My PhD, my international contracts, my firm that was setting new standards in the industry, all of it in their world was distilled down to a convenient family utility. The great Charlotte Smith reduced to coordinating canapes and floral arrangements. I forced a smile. "Of course, I'll call her in the morning." Later that night, I stood before the fireplace, staring at a silver-framed photo from our wedding day. We looked so happy, so certain, but my gaze drifted past our smiling faces to the memory of a stuffy lawyer's office in Charleston. Genevieve sitting ramrod straight, quietly but firmly insisting on a morality clause in our prenup. A clause about upholding the family name, about public comportment, about giving them grounds to walk away with everything if I ever embarrassed them. "It's just paper," Charlie Julian had told me later, taking my hands in his. "A silly tradition to make Mother happy. It doesn't mean anything to us." At the time I had believed him. I had ignored the bright, screaming red flag because I was in love. Now it felt less like a memory and more like a premonition. I walked back to my laptop and pulled up the website for the Big Sur resort, Ethelgard. The photos were breathtaking. Rustic chic villas perched on jagged cliffs, infinity pools that blended into the Pacific ancient redwoods, standing like silent sentinels. The name I saw with a quick search was Old English. It meant noble protector. It was stunningly beautiful and completely isolated. A profound sense of dread, cold and heavy, settled over me. This wasn't a birthday celebration. This was a venue, a stage. And as I stared at the crashing waves on the screen, I had the sudden certain intuition that this trip wasn't a party. It was a meticulously planned execution. The silence in our apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt suffocating, a vacuum waiting to be filled with the unspoken, terrible truths of our marriage. The phone call came 2 days later. Julian's voice was slick with a practiced sort of regret. "Charlie, hey," he began, the telltale hesitation already setting my teeth on edge. "You're not going to believe this, but the Henderson deal? It just exploded. I have to be in London for the rest of the week." I swiveled in my leather office chair, looking out at the clean architectural lines of the Chicago skyline. I pictured him in his office, loosening his tie, running a hand through his perfect hair as he delivered the lie. The Henderson deal. I repeated, my voice flat. "The one that's been dormant for 6 months. That's the one it's back on out of nowhere. It's a monster," he said, his voice full of feigned excitement. "I am so sorry. I know we were going to fly down together. You'll have to go to Charleston alone for the planning trip." I didn't sigh. I didn't argue. I had learned that arguing with a thorn was like arguing with the tide. It just wears you down. "Don't worry about it, Julian." I said the words tasting like ash. "I'm a big girl. I can handle your family for a few days. I knew you'd understand." "You're the best," he said, the relief in his voice palpable even through the phone. "I'll make it up to you, I promise." I hung up the promise, echoing in the quiet of my office. His promises had become a currency with no value. The trip, I knew, was not about planning a party. It was a test, and I was being sent into the heart of it alone. Flying into Charleston was like flying into a different time. The crisp, cool air of Chicago gave way to a thick, humid blanket that settled on my skin the moment I stepped out of the airport. The Thorne Mansion was even more oppressive than I remembered. It stood like a monument to a forgotten era, its white columns like bones, the ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, weeping over the manicured lawns. The air inside was heavy still and smelled of lemon polish and a faint sweet scent of decay. Margot, Julian's younger sister, greeted me at the door. Her smile was a perfect sharp crescent. "Charlotte," she said, her voice a smooth southern drawl that could cut glass. "You made it. Julian sends his deepest regrets. He's so very busy." She led me up the grand curving staircase, her hand trailing possessively along the polished mahogany banister. "I do hope you'll be comfortable. The guest wing can feel a bit isolated." She gestured to a series of portraits on the wall, all stern-faced men and severe-looking women. "That's our great-great-grandfather Beauregard Thorne. He built this house. It takes generations to create something that lasts, you know." She paused and looked right at me, her eyes glittering. Some people just don't understand that history isn't something you can buy or build. It's in your blood. My meeting the next morning was with Genevieve and the family's event planner, a flustered woman named Mrs. DuPont, who treated Julian's mother with the reverence of a courtier addressing a queen. We sat in a stifling drawing room surrounded by velvet curtains and heavy dark furniture. For the evening's primary musical entertainment, I began laying out a proposal I was thinking we could engage a contemporary string ensemble. There's a wonderful group out of San Francisco that reinterprets classical pieces with a modern sensibility. It's elegant, but unexpected. Genevieve, who had been examining her perfect manicure, looked up. A slight, almost imperceptible tightening around her lips was the only sign of her displeasure. "A modern sensibility?" She repeated the words, dripping with disdain. She turned to Mrs. DuPont, dismissing me completely. "We will have the Palmetto Quartet as always. They will perform a selection of Vivaldi and Bach." She then turned her gaze back to me, a dismissive flick of her eyes. "We value tradition, dear, not fleeting trends." The slight was as clear and sharp as a slap in the face. I was a fleeting trend. The first major discovery happened by accident that afternoon. A vendor for the Big Sur party needed a copy of a property deed for their insurance rider, and Alistair had told me it was in his study. The study was his sanctuary, a room of dark wood-worn leather and the smell of old books and cigar smoke. I searched for an hour, the humid air making the papers stick together. Frustrated, I yanked open a stubborn drawer in his massive antique desk. It came out further than it should have, and with a soft click, a thin panel on the side of the desk popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. My heart gave a little jump. Inside, covered in a fine layer of dust, was not the deed, but a stack of old leather-bound ledgers. Curiosity got the better of me. I lifted one out. The leather was dry and cracked, the pages brittle. The entries were in a spidery, elegant cursive, detailing shipping manifests from the late 1800s. I wasn't a historian, but I was an analyst. I lived by numbers and patterns. And something was wrong. Certain cargo shipments, listed as simple textiles or agricultural equipment, were noted with a strange coded symbol next to them, and the profits recorded from these specific shipments were astronomical, completely disproportionate to the declared goods. My logical mind screamed that it was an anomaly, an equation that didn't balance. I quickly took photos of several pages with my phone, my hands shaking slightly before sliding the ledger back and closing the hidden panel. That evening, at a charity gala at the Hibernian Hall, I saw the Charleston Code in full effect. The Thorns moved through the crowd as a single unit, a fortress of shared smiles and whispered inside jokes. They closed ranks, their conversation a coded language I couldn't decipher. It was there that Genevieve, with a triumphant smile, introduced me to Blythe Kensington. Blythe was a walking, talking Charleston dream. Tall blonde, dressed in a pale pink dress that probably cost more than my first car. She radiated a kind of effortless belonging that I knew I could never achieve. "Charlotte, it is just so wonderful to finally meet you," Blythe gushed, taking my hand. "Julian talks about you all the time." Her eyes, a startling shade of blue, held a glint of something that was not kindness. "We were just catching up last week. He seems under a lot of pressure," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She squeezed my hand, her gaze holding mine for a fraction of a second too long. The message was unmistakable. It was intimate. It was a warning. He comes to me when he's under pressure. Later, as I was trying to become invisible near the French doors leading to the veranda, Alistair appeared beside me, a glass of bourbon in his hand. "Quite the circus, isn't it?" he said, his voice a low rumble. He surprised me by asking about the Soul Project, referencing my TEDx talk with an accuracy that told me he'd actually watched it. For a moment, I felt a flicker of connection. Then he looked out at the crowd, at his wife holding court. "Genevieve believes the most important thing, the only thing really, is protecting the family's legacy," he said, his voice quiet. He took a sip of his bourbon. "Sometimes that means making difficult choices for the good of the whole." He looked at me, then his eyes unreadable in the dim light. It didn't sound like advice. It sounded like a threat. On the plane back to Chicago the next day, I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, the city lights a blur below. The oppressive weight of Charleston finally lifted, but my mind was racing. I saw two images, sharp and clear, the coded spidery script in the old ledgers and Blythe Kensington's perfectly polished, possessive smile, a hidden past and a planned future, and I realized with a certainty that made my blood run cold that the Thorne legacy wasn't just history. It was a secret they were all desperate to protect. And Julian wasn't a passive bystander caught in the middle. He was a gatekeeper. This trip hadn't been about planning a party. It had been about showing me the walls of my cage and reminding me exactly where I stood on the outside. When I returned to Chicago, the silence in our apartment was different. It was no longer the controlled, peaceful quiet I had engineered. It was a vacuum, a void stretching between two people pretending to share a life. The emotional distance between us was now a physical presence in the room as palpable as the cold glass of the windows. Julian was a ghost in his own home. He was constantly on his phone, his thumb a blur across the screen. When I'd walk into the living room, he'd angle the phone away with a movement so practiced it was almost invisible. He took his calls on the balcony now, even in the biting Chicago wind, his voice a low, urgent murmur lost to the gales. Work stress, he'd say, coming back inside his cheeks, flushed from the cold, his eyes avoiding mine. This Henderson deal is a killer. But his excuses were transparently false. They were flimsy shields that couldn't hide the truth I already felt in my bones. He was, for the first time since I'd met him, a completely closed book. My professional instincts, the part of my mind that analyzes systems and finds their hidden flaws, took over. My entire career was built on understanding how information travels, how sound waves find secret paths through solid walls, how a structure's design can either conceal or reveal. I decided to apply that same mindset to my marriage. Julian. I said one evening, my voice a mask of professional helpfulness, "To keep things from getting messy with all the vendors for Big Sur, I'm setting up a shared cloud server, a central place for invoices, contracts, seating charts. It'll help us all stay organized, especially with you being so busy." He barely looked up from his tablet. "Great idea, Charlie," he murmured. "Whatever makes it easier." He had no idea what he'd just agreed to. In reality, I wasn't just organizing a party. I was opening a window. For a week, the drive was exactly what it appeared to be, a collection of vendor contracts and menu options. Then one night, sleep was an impossibility. The silence in the apartment felt charged electric. I got up and went to my office, the city lights a glittering, indifferent tapestry below. I logged into the cloud server just to review a florist's contract. And that's when I saw it. A new device had been synced, Julian Thorne's iPad Pro. My husband, a man who could barely figure out how to attach a document to an email, had accidentally synced his entire personal tablet to our shared family drive instead of just the specific party folder. My breath caught. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. It felt like a violation, but the suspicion that had been a low hum in my soul was now a screaming siren. I clicked on the device folder, and there it was, a single solitary folder labeled simply private. It was password protected. My mind raced. What would he use? A birthday? Too obvious. I tried a few, and they all failed. Then a memory surfaced, a story he'd told me when we were first dating about a golden retriever he'd had as a boy, a dog he'd adored. My fingers typed the letters, my heart pounding a heavy, frantic rhythm against my ribs. B-E-A-U. The folder opened, and inside was a digital Pandora's box. The architecture of my life collapsed in an instant. First, the emails, a chain between Julian and Blythe Kensington stretching back more than a year. They were intensely personal, filled with pet names and shared jokes. They weren't just catching up. They were planning a life. Once the Charlotte situation is handled, one of Julian's read, we can finally be done with all this. Pretense. Blythe's reply. Just be strong, my love. It's almost over. I'm picking out fabrics for the Charleston house. Thinking of a lovely blue for our bedroom. A wave of nausea washed over me. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles white, but I kept clicking. Next, a legal document, a PDF from the Thorne family's top law firm in Charleston. It wasn't a divorce filing. It was a petition for an annulment. The grounds were listed in cold clinical legalese fraud. They were building a case that I had married Julian under false pretenses, that I had misrepresented my background, my intentions, that my entire identity was a lie designed to ensnare him. An annulment wouldn't just end the marriage, it would erase it. It would invalidate the prenup. It would declare me a ghost who had never really been there at all. Then, the financials, statement after statement showing large systematic transfers of funds. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved from Julian's personal and joint accounts into a series of offshore trusts controlled by his father. They weren't just planning to erase me, they were methodically stripping our marital assets, ensuring that even if the annulment failed, there would be nothing left for me to claim. And last, the thing that made the blood freeze in my veins, a file named simply the script. It was a 12-page document authored by Genevieve. It was a minute-by-minute, day-by-day playbook for the week in Big Sur. It detailed a campaign of psychological warfare designed to subtly isolate and undermine me at every turn. It had lines of dialogue for Julian, for Margot, for Alistair. It described how they would provoke an emotional outburst from me, an outburst they could then use as evidence of my instability. And there on page 10 was the plan for the final dinner. Stage 7, she had titled it, the public severance. The missing chair wasn't going to be an oversight. It was the climax of their play. Tears did not come. The shock was too deep, the betrayal too absolute. What I felt instead was a rage so pure and so cold, it was like a shard of ice forming in my chest. I felt the floor drop out from beneath me, but in the free fall, my mind had never been clearer. This wasn't just a failing marriage. This wasn't just a man having an affair. This was a coordinated, premeditated conspiracy. I spent the rest of the night in a state of chilling focus. Meticulously, I downloaded every file, every email, every statement. I created multiple encrypted backups, storing them on secure servers they could never find. I was an architect of silence, and they had just given me the blueprint to their entire corrupt design. As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of gray and rose, I finally leaned back in my chair. The work was done. Julian was still sleeping peacefully in our bedroom, his breath a soft, even rhythm. A man dreaming perhaps of his future with another woman in a house I had unknowingly helped him pay for. I looked at his profile in the dim light, and I felt no sadness, no heartbreak. I saw him only with the detached, analytical eye of an engineer studying a structure that has suffered a catastrophic systemic failure. I knew then that I couldn't confront them. Confrontation was what they wanted. It was written into their script. They had written a play, cast me as the tragic, hysterical lead, and built a beautiful stage for my demise. But I decided right then and there, sitting in the silence of my shattered life, I would not be performing their script. I would be rewriting the entire production. The woman who walked out of my office the morning after the discovery was not the same one who had walked in. The rage so cold and so pure had not dissipated. Instead, it had solidified. It had become a foundation, a structure. My grief was a private thing, a death I would mourn later. For now, There was work to be done. My demeanor changed overnight. I became the perfect, compliant wife-to-be exiled. The change was so seamless, so complete, that it was utterly believable. I was suddenly enthusiastic, helpful, and agreeable. I made cheerful morning calls to Genevieve to discuss floral arrangements, my voice a confection of sugar and deference. I sent Margot links to designer gowns for the party, with notes like, "This would look breathtaking on you." They were completely disarmed. In their world, a woman scorned either became a hysterical shrew or a weeping puddle. This new version of me, this cheerful, helpful, slightly vapid version, fit neatly into their narrative of a woman desperately trying to win back their affection. They believed I was oblivious. They believed their plan was working perfectly. The keystone of my own plan was presented to Julian over dinner a few nights later. I made his favorite meal, coq au vin, and opened a bottle of the expensive Bordeaux he loved. "Julian," I began, my voice soft and earnest. "I was thinking about your mother's birthday. It's such a milestone, and I want to do something special, something from the heart." He looked up from his plate, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. "Oh," he asked. "A video montage," I said, the idea spilling out as if I'd just thought of it. "A surprise. I was thinking I could record everyone. You, your father, Margot, sharing little anecdotes and memories of her. I could edit it all together with music. A tribute. What do you think?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was searching for the angle, the trick, but he found none. All he saw was his slightly out-of-her-depth wife trying to score points with his mother. It was pathetic, and therefore perfectly safe. "A video," he repeated slowly. He then smiled a genuine, condescending smile. "Charlie, that's actually very sweet of you." He reached across the table and patted my hand. "Sure, if you think you can handle the technical side of it. That's a lovely idea." "Oh, I can handle it," I said, my smile bright and brittle. And with that one dismissive blessing, I had my cover story, my reason to bring a full kit of professional-grade discrete audio and video recording equipment to Big Sur. But my real project was far more ambitious. They saw me as a party planner. They had forgotten that I was an architect of sound. I spent the next week of nights not looking at flower arrangements, but at the architectural plans for the Ethelgard Resort. It was a masterpiece of modern design, yes, all glass and limestone and soaring cedar ceilings, but to my eye, it was an acoustic map. I saw how the hard, reflective surface of the limestone pavilion would carry a hushed whisper clear across the room. I saw how the dense redwood paneling in the wine cellar would trap sound, turning it into a perfect private confession booth. I saw the natural amplification corridors created by the angle of the cliffs and the construction of the garden terraces. They had chosen a fortress of isolation. I would turn it into a recording studio. Using my company's credentials, I contacted the original San Francisco architectural firm that had designed the resort. I told the lead partner I was writing a piece for a professional journal on the acoustic challenges of cliffside construction. He was flattered. Architects love to talk about their work. He granted me full access to the detailed blueprints, including the HVAC layouts, the wiring diagrams, and the structural supports. I now knew the building's secrets. I knew where its bones were buried. 2 weeks before the party, I flew to Big Sur for a final venue walkthrough. "You're going all the way out there just for a walkthrough?" Julian had asked, a touch of annoyance in his voice. "Every detail has to be perfect, Julian." I'd replied, my voice full of anxious sincerity. "For your mother." The moment I arrived at Ethelgard, I put my plan into motion. My movements were a ballet of chilling precision. I identified my 3 key locations. First, the private lounge attached to Genevieve and Alistair's master suite, the Nerve Center. Second, the secluded, windswept garden terrace where I knew they would take their morning coffees. And third, the cool subterranean wine cellar where I anticipated the darkest conversations would happen. The microphones were my masterpieces of deceit, no bigger than a grain of rice with a battery life of 2 weeks and voice-activated recording. Using the blueprints, I placed them with an engineer's precision. In the lounge, a tiny microphone replaced a decorative screw head on the back of a heavy, ornate picture frame. On the terrace, another was slipped into a minuscule crack in the stone fireplace, perfectly shielded from the wind. And in the wine cellar, the last one was adhered to the dark, unfinished wood on the underside of a wine rack, completely invisible in the gloom. I was planting ears in the very walls of their conspiracy. I was in Genevieve's lounge on a small stepladder, making the final adjustment to the picture frame, when I heard the sound of a key card in the door. My blood ran cold. I froze. The door swung open, and a young woman from the hotel staff stepped inside, carrying a vase of fresh flowers. My mind raced. I couldn't just climb down. She'd ask what I was doing. I had 1 second to choose my role. I swayed on the ladder, letting out a small gasp, one hand flying to my head. "Oh my goodness," I breathed. The staffer rushed forward, her face a mask of concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Yes, I'm fine," I said, pressing my fingertips to my temple as I carefully climbed down. I gave her a weak, slightly embarrassed smile. "It's just the heights and this view." I gestured vaguely to the panoramic window, showing the dizzying drop to the ocean below. "It's just a little overwhelming. I understand completely," she said, her professional sympathy kicking in. "Can I get you a glass of water? Oh, would you? You're so kind," I said. As she turned to the minibar, I gave the room a sweeping, appreciative glance. "Your resort is just impeccable. The craftsmanship is extraordinary." It was a perfect piece of misdirection, playing on her pride in her workplace. She was completely at ease, her brief moment of curiosity erased. She brought me the water, I thanked her profusely, and she left. I leaned against the wall, my heart hammering. My performance had been flawless. I was just a fragile, slightly overwhelmed woman, easily impressed and easily dismissed. I was invisible. Back in Chicago that night, after Julian was asleep, I went into my office and closed the door. I put on a pair of high-fidelity, noise-canceling headphones and opened the secure audio app on my laptop. I clicked the button to activate the feed. First, there was static, then a clear, clean connection. I could hear the faint, low hum of the Ethelgard Resort's ventilation system, the whisper of the wind off the Pacific. It was the sound of an empty stage waiting for the actors to arrive. I had transformed their fortress into my personal listening station. The game had changed. They thought they were the ones watching me, but I was the one who was listening. The Thorn clan descended upon Ethelgard, not like a family arriving for a vacation, but like a conquering army taking possession of a new territory. A fleet of gleaming black SUVs crunched up the gravel driveway, disgorging mountains of designer luggage, and the Thorns themselves, dressed in expensive casual resort wear that screamed old money. They moved with an orchestrated, languid power, the resort staff swarming around them like pilot fish on a shark. Julian and I arrived last in our own rental. He held my hand as we walked into the soaring cedar and glass lobby, a gesture that was meant to look intimate, but felt like a man leading a prize lamb to a beautifully appointed slaughterhouse. And that's when the show began. It was the first move from Genevieve's script, Stage 2, The Subtle Separation. We approached the check-in desk, where the concierge, a man with a practiced welcoming smile, greeted us by name, Mr. and Mrs. Thorn. "Welcome to Ethelgard." But as he went to retrieve our room key, a look of theatrical confusion crossed his face. "Oh, how strange," he murmured, tapping at his computer. "I seem to have misplaced your folio. One moment." The rest of the family, their check-in process impossibly smooth, was already being whisked away on electric golf carts toward their cliffside villas. Genevieve glanced back over her shoulder, a tiny satisfied smile playing on her lips before she turned away. It was a small, deliberate act of separation designed to leave us standing there awkward and isolated. Honestly, Julian sighed with performative frustration, running a hand through his hair. For a place like this, you'd think they'd be more organized. He was playing his part beautifully, the concerned husband frustrated by the resort's incompetence. I just stood there, my bag at my feet, and played my own part. "It's fine, Julian," I said, my voice pitched to sound patient and slightly weary. "These things happen." The week unfolded as a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare, a series of beautifully curated moments designed to chip away at my sense of belonging until nothing was left. Every move was straight from the pages of Genevieve's script. On our first full day, a spontaneous family hike to a secluded cove was announced over breakfast on the main terrace. Margot mentioned it casually, as if the plan had just occurred to her. "Mother, we should all hike down to Partington Cove this morning. The light will be perfect." A chorus of agreement went around the table. I was only told about it as they were all standing up to leave. "Oh, Charlotte, you're coming, aren't you?" Margot asked, her eyes wide with false innocence. Of course I didn't have the proper hiking shoes, only the fashionable sneakers I'd worn for the flight. I was forced to demur, explaining I wasn't prepared. "Oh, what a shame," Genevieve said, patting my arm. "Well, you can enjoy some quiet time by the pool, dear." I did not go to the pool. I went back to our suite, put on my headphones, and listened. I heard them on the terrace, their voices carried on the salty air captured by the microphone in the fireplace. "It's for the best," Genevieve's voice said, crisp and clear. "The terrain is quite rugged. She's not exactly the outdoorsy type, is she?" A ripple of soft, condescending laughter followed. The next afternoon, Alistair had arranged a private wine tasting in the resort's famous cellar. The sommelier, a severe-looking man with a silver tasting cup around his neck, had clearly been prepped. He poured exquisite vintages, launching into detailed histories of each one. He discussed the 1988 vintage, the year of Julian's birth, and the 1991 vintage, the year of Margot's. My birth year was conspicuously absent from the lesson plan. I was an invisible woman, sitting at a table laden with history that was not my own. Later, Julian put his arm around me as we walked back to our villa. "Sorry about that," he said quietly. "You know how these old-school sommeliers are? So particular." He was apologizing for the sommelier, not for the deliberate cruel exclusion he had orchestrated. Each day was another small cut. At dinner, they reminisced endlessly about past family trips to Gstaad, to St. Bart's, to their grandfather's hunting lodge in Scotland. They told stories that began with Julian, "Do you remember the time?" and ended in peals of shared laughter. When I attempted to join in to share a memory from a trip Julian and I had taken to Lake Como, Margot cut me off seamlessly. "Oh, that reminds me of the time we were in Gstaad, Julian," she interrupted, her voice bright and sharp. "Do you remember that dreadful ski instructor with the orange parka?" And just like that, the conversation was wrested away from me. The door to their shared history slammed shut in my face. Through it all, I played my role to perfection. I was the slightly confused, slightly hurt, but ever-compliant wife. I would appear flustered when accidentally left out. I would express mild disappointment, but never anger, never suspicion. I was giving them the exact performance they wanted, lulling them deeper and deeper into their false sense of security. But every night after Julian fell into the deep, untroubled sleep of a man with no conscience, my own work began. I would sit in the darkness of our villa, the Pacific roaring below, and put on my headphones. And the truth, the raw, unfiltered truth, would pour into my ears. The recordings were a gold mine. I listened to Genevieve coaching Julian in their private lounge. "Remember to mention how well Blythe is doing with her new charity," her voice instructed, smooth as poison. "It's important that Charlotte understands what a real Charleston family looks like, what it means to contribute. It will make her feel her own lack of standing." I listened to Alistair and Julian in the wine cellar, their voices low and conspiratorial, perfectly captured by the bug on the wine rack. "The transfers are complete," Alistair said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The last of it is firewalled in the Cayman Trust. By the time she figures out what's happening, it will be a fortress. The annulment will sever her from everything. And then tonight, the night before the birthday dinner." I listened to a conversation from that morning on the garden terrace between Genevieve and Margot. Margot, to my surprise, expressed a sliver of doubt, her voice wavering. "Mother, isn't this all a bit cruel? The chair and everything." Genevieve's response was immediate and so ice-cold it chilled me to the bone even through the headphones. "It's not cruelty, dear," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's surgery. We are excising a malignancy to save the body. A malignancy. That's what I was to them. A disease." I took off the headphones and walked out onto our balcony. The sea fog was rolling in thick and white, obscuring the stars, swallowing the horizon. It felt like the world was disappearing. I leaned on the cool stone railing, the recording echoing in my mind. A malignancy. I no longer felt hurt. I no longer felt betrayed. The emotions had burned away, leaving behind something hard and clear and unbrittle. I felt like a strategist on the eve of a great battle, my enemy's entire playbook, their every secret move laid out before me. I walked back inside, sat down at my laptop, and opened a new encrypted email. The recipient was my lawyer in Chicago, a sharp, ruthless woman who had once told me, "I hope you never need me, but if you do, it means you're ready to burn it all down." The subject line was 2 words, contingency protocol. The body of the email was even shorter. Activate. I hit send. The battle had begun. The air in our villa was thick with the scent of my perfume and unspoken words as I got ready. I was not nervous. The woman who had cried over a spreadsheet of lies was gone. In her place was a calm, cold strategist. I felt like an actress in the wings waiting for her cue, every line memorized, every movement blocked. Tonight was not a dinner. It was a performance. I stepped out of the dressing room, and Julian, who was fixing his cufflinks in the mirror, stopped cold. The dress was my armor. It was a column of deep, lustrous emerald green silk that clung to every curve. In a sea of muted Charleston pastels, it was a defiant jewel tone, the color of life, of envy, of poison. It was a declaration before I ever spoke a word. For a single unguarded moment, the mask slipped from Julian's face. I saw a flicker of the man I had met in Austin, a flash of raw desire, of admiration, maybe even of regret. It was there, and then it was gone, replaced by the cool, polite facade of the man who was about to publicly execute our marriage. "You look stunning, Charlie," he said, his voice a little tight. "Thank you, Julian." I replied, my smile serene. "It's a special occasion after all." We walked to the dinner location in a charged silence. The setting sun bled across the sky in dramatic streaks of orange and purple, painting the Pacific in hues of fire. The Thorne family walked ahead of us, a laughing, confident pack, their voices carried back on the salty breeze. We were the trailing edge of the procession, walking toward the private glass pavilion as if it were a scaffold. The pavilion was breathtaking, a jewel box perched on the edge of the world. Inside, a single long table was exquisitely set with silver crystal and cascades of white orchids. It was set for 12. Genevieve, the guest of honor, made her entrance to a smattering of enthusiastic applause from her family. One by one, they moved to the table, finding their calligraphed place cards, the sound of their light chatter echoing in the glass room. Julian and I were last. He moved purposefully toward his assigned seat next to his mother, giving my arm a small performative squeeze before letting go. I approached the spot beside him, the spot where my name should have been. And there it was, or rather, there it wasn't. No chair, no place setting of silver and china, no crystal glass waiting to be filled, just a perfect polished empty space of floor between my husband and his sister, a void, a deliberate screaming nothingness. For a heartbeat the world seemed to slow down. I could hear the distant crash of waves, the clink of a fork against a plate, the soft murmur of conversations that studiously continued around the table. They were all looking, but not looking. The weight of their collective feigned ignorance was a physical force. It was exactly as the script had dictated. It was Genevieve who finally broke the spell, her voice dripping with the mock concern she had rehearsed. She looked up from her plate, her diamond earrings catching the last light of the sun. "Oh my," she said, her brow furrowed in a perfect imitation of confusion. "Charlotte, dear." "Is there a problem?" Julian played his part next, half rising from his chair, a look of mild alarm on his face. How strange, he said, his performance flawless. The resort must have miscounted. "Let me get someone." He seemed concerned but not alarmed. He was an actor hitting his mark. Margot delivered the final line of their opening act, her voice sharp with faux embarrassment. "Well, this is dreadfully embarrassing," she declared to the table. "For the resort, I mean. This was it, the moment, the culmination of their planning. They all watched me, their faces a mixture of pity and predatory anticipation. They expected me to crumble, to flush with shame, to stammer, to cry, to make a scene. They were waiting for the hysterical, unstable woman from their annulment petition to make her grand debut. I let the silence hang in the air. I let it stretch and stretch until it became taut and heavy and deeply uncomfortable for them. I looked around the table, my gaze moving slowly, deliberately, from one face to the next. I saw Margot's smugness. I saw Alistair's uncomfortable, complicit stare into his water glass. I saw Genevieve's triumphant reptilian smirk. And finally, I looked at Julian, at my husband. His expression was carefully, perfectly blank. When I finally spoke, my voice was not a whisper. It was perfectly calm, perfectly clear, the acoustics of the glass pavilion carrying it to every ear. "Please," I said, a serene smile touching my lips. "Don't trouble the staff." I paused, letting the words settle. "It's not a miscount." The family froze. A fork stopped halfway to a mouth. The air crackled. This was not in the script. I looked directly at Julian, my smile unwavering. "It's a clarification." The effect was instantaneous. The blood drained from Julian's face. Genevieve's triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of pure shock. They were actors whose lead had just walked off the page. I let my gaze sweep across all of them, the architects of my humiliation. "Thank you all," I said, my voice still light, almost conversational, for making it so clear. And then I turned, not in shame, not in anger, but with the slow, deliberate grace of a queen leaving a room of disloyal subjects. I walked toward the glass doors, my head held high, the emerald silk of my gown whispering against the polished floor. "Charlotte, don't be so dramatic," Julian's voice called after me, but it had lost its practiced ease. It was higher now, edged with the first real unscripted note of panic. "We can fix this." I stopped at the door, my hand on the cool metal handle. I turned back one last time to look at them, a tableau of stunned, horrified faces, their perfect party suddenly in ruins around them. I gave Julian a small, pitying smile. "Oh, Julian," I said, my voice soft, but carrying the finality of a closing door. "I'm not the one who needs to fix anything." I pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night air, leaving them in the wreckage of their own design. The missing chair was meant to be my exit cue. Instead, I had just turned it into the opening salvo of my war. I didn't retreat to my villa. Retreat was for victims. I walked my emerald gown whispering against the stone path, not back toward my sham of a marriage, but toward my real work. My destination was a pre-booked conference suite on a different floor of the resort, reserved 2 weeks ago, under my company's name, Smith Acoustics. The Thorns thought I had come to their party. The truth was, I had come to my office. The suite was cool and dark. The only light came from the blue and green glow of the 3 monitors I'd had delivered earlier, arranged on the long conference table like a triptych of judgment. This was my command center, my war room equipped with my laptop, a secure satellite internet connection that bypassed the resort's network, and a pot of brutally strong coffee. I sat down, the silk of my gown pooling around the leather chair, and I initiated the cascade. It began with a single click. I logged into a secure portal connected to my lawyer's office in Chicago. My email, the one with the subject line contingency protocol, had been the trigger. My lawyer, a woman named Lena, who was less a lawyer and more a legal pit bull, would have received it the moment I walked out of that pavilion. And she would have acted. The emergency petition would already be filed with the court, a digital missile launched across time zones, and attached to it the payload, the single damning piece of evidence that made everything else possible, the audio file, The one from the wine cellar where Alistair Thorne, in his low, gravelly voice, explained to his son exactly how they were moving marital assets into untraceable offshore accounts. The annulment will sever her from everything. The petition requested an immediate ex parte freeze on every known Thorne and Julian-specific asset, pending a full investigation into fraudulent conveyance. As I sat there, I knew automated alerts were screaming through the compliance departments of their primary banks in Charleston and New York. The walls of their financial fortress were already beginning to crumble. I picked up my phone and dialed the resort's general manager, a man named Mr. Davies, with whom I'd spent hours building a professional, courteous rapport. Mr. Davies, I began, my voice calm and professional. Charlotte Smith calling. I apologize for the late hour, but I'm calling regarding a potential security breach. Mrs. Thorne, he asked, his voice laced with confusion. Is everything all right? I was just about to call regarding the situation at the pavilion dinner. That situation is the reason for my call, I said smoothly. It appears the booking for the Thorne party may have been made under fraudulent pretenses. As a security precaution, I've had to place an immediate hold on my corporate card that was on file. I'm rescinding my company's guarantee effective immediately. I let that hang in the air for a moment. You'll need to secure a new method of payment from Mr. Alistair Thorne for all services rendered and for the remainder of the week's bookings. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I had just transformed the Thornes from his most prestigious VIP guests into a massive 7-figure financial liability. I'm sending you a digitally signed letter confirming this for your records right now. I added and hit send on the pre-written email. Thank you for your understanding. I hung up before he could protest. I opened one last file. It contained the high-resolution photos of the coded entries from Alistair's secret ledger. My weeks of cross-referencing them with historical shipping archives had paid off. The foundation of the Thorne family legacy wasn't just in shipping, it was in smuggling. Opium illegal arms, a history of gilded criminality that would shatter their blue-blooded Charleston reputation. I drafted a new anonymous email from an encrypted address. I attached the scans of the ledger pages and a brief cutting analysis of their meaning. I sent it to a single recipient, a notoriously tenacious investigative reporter at the Charleston Post and Courier, a woman whose entire career was built on digging up the skeletons in the closets of the city's most powerful families. I had just planted a bomb in the heart of their legacy with a very long fuse. Then my own phone buzzed, a text from Julian. "Where are you? Get back here. Mother is furious." I ignored it. I pulled up another screen, a live feed from a security camera overlooking the pavilion's entrance. Access I had gained after giving Mr. Davies a free hour-long consultation on the vulnerabilities of his resort security system. I watched as Mr. Davies, flanked by 2 serious-looking security guards, strode purposefully toward the glass pavilion. My phone buzzed again. "Julian, Charlotte, the hotel manager, is here. He's talking about payment. What did you do?" I watched on the monitor as Mr. Davies leaned down to speak to Alistair. I saw the confusion on Alistair's face turn to alarm. I saw him pull out his wallet. I saw Mr. Davies shake his head. I saw the ripples of panic spread around the table like a contagion. My phone rang. "Julian." I let it ring, the sound clinical and distant in the quiet room. It stopped, then immediately rang again. This time I answered, putting it on speaker. His voice was a panicked hiss, a snake cornered in a cage. "Charlotte, what the hell is this? My cards! My father's cards! They're all being declined." I leaned back in my chair, my own voice glacial calm and perfectly clear. "That's the sound of silence, Julian," I said. "It's the sound a bank account makes when it has been frozen by a federal court order, pending a fraud investigation." I let the words sink in. "I have the recordings, by the way. All of them." I paused. The wine cellar chat was particularly illuminating. There was a sharp, strangled gasp on the other end of the line, the sound of a man whose entire world had just ceased to exist. He was speechless. "Enjoy your dinner," I said, and ended the call. I turned my full attention back to the monitors, a faint smile playing on my lips. The perfect birthday party had devolved into a frantic, humiliating ballet of chaos. The cascade had begun, and it was far, far from over. The aftermath of a controlled demolition is a cloud of dust and a terrible silence. For the Thorns, that dust cloud was settling in their master suite, and the silence was the sound of their world ending. From my command center, I listened. The microphones I had planted were no longer just listening devices. They were conduits of chaos, piping the raw, unfiltered terror of the Thorn family directly into my ears. Ethelgard, the noble protector, had become their prison, a beautiful 5-star cage with an astronomical bill they could not pay. Mr. Davies, the resort manager, had been ruthlessly efficient. He had politely informed them that until their outstanding balance, now swollen with penalties for the cancellation of a week's worth of helicopters, yacht excursions, and private chefs, was settled in full, they were to remain on the property. Checkout was not an option. Their luggage was their collateral. They were under a polite but very firm form of hotel arrest. And the court order I had set in motion? It had worked faster and more completely than I could have dreamed. Their credit cards were frozen, the wire transfers they attempted from their primary accounts were blocked. Their vast generational wealth was a distant mirage inaccessible. They were trapped, truly trapped, in the most beautiful prison in the world. And I listened to them break. Through the microphone in their lounge, I heard Genevieve. The regal matriarch was gone, replaced by a pacing, hysterical creature of pure rage. "How could you let this happen, Alistair?" She shrieked, her voice a shrill, ugly thing. Decades of building our name, our reputation, ruined by that acoustician. The way she spat the word, my profession, my identity, it was the ultimate insult. I heard Alistair, the quiet patriarch, his voice a low, frantic rumble, as he tried his lawyers, his offshore bankers, anyone he could think of on the East Coast. But it was the middle of the night there. All he got was the smooth, infuriatingly calm voices of voicemail systems, the sound of a powerful man realizing his power had vanished. And Margot, dear superficial Margot. I could hear her sobbing, punctuated by the clink of ice in a glass. Everyone will know she wailed. At the yacht club, at the Spoleto Festival, everyone will see us as poor will be a laughingstock. Her concern wasn't for their family, but for their social calendar. Then came Julian. I switched my view to the security camera feed for the hallway outside my suite, and there he was, striding down the hall, his face a mask of thunderous rage. He was coming to storm the castle, to confront the witch. He raised his fist and hammered on my door. "Charlotte, open this door. We are going to talk about this right now," he bellowed. I didn't move. I simply picked up my phone and dialed resort security. "Hello," I said calmly. "This is Charlotte Smith in the Pescadero suite. My soon-to-be ex-husband, Julian Thorne, is creating a disturbance outside my door. I feel unsafe." The response was immediate. 2 uniformed guards appeared at the end of the hall, their walk purposeful. They approached Julian, their bodies forming a polite but impassable barrier. I watched on my screen as my husband, the golden scion of Charleston, was reduced to arguing with hotel security, his humiliation absolute and public. He eventually retreated, defeated a king with no kingdom. An hour later, the negotiation began. A single piece of hotel stationery was slipped under my door. The handwriting was Julian's, an angry, desperate scrawl. "We need to talk. Name your price." Price. It was so predictable. So Thorne. They still thought this was about money. They still didn't understand me at all. I took out a single sheet of my own heavy linen paper. I typed out my response. Not a negotiation. Not a request. A list of non-negotiable terms of surrender. I called the front desk and asked for a bellman. 10 minutes later, I handed the sealed envelope to a young man in a crisp uniform. "Please deliver this to the Thorne party in the Cypress Villa," I said. Immediately, I watched them on the monitor as the bellman delivered the envelope. I saw Julian snatch it, rip it open. I watched as he read it, his face going from anger to confusion to a slack-jawed, ashen horror. I watched as he passed the single sheet of paper to his father, who read it and seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. Then Genevieve took it, her hands shaking, her eyes scanning the page as if it were coated in acid. This is what they read. My price. First, a full written confession from Julian Thorne detailing his year-long affair with Blythe Kensington and the coordinated conspiracy to fraudulently annul our marriage to protect his assets. To be signed, dated, and notarized. Second, a full written confession from Genevieve and Alistair Thorne admitting to the plan to defame me and to the systematic illegal hiding of marital assets in offshore accounts. To be signed, dated, and notarized. Third, the irrevocable transfer of 50% of all frozen assets, both domestic and offshore, to be repatriated and deposited directly into a trust of my choosing. This was not the amount dictated by our worthless prenup. This was the price for the recordings, the price for my silence. Fourth, a public statement to be drafted by my lawyer and approved by me, retracting any and all negative implications against my character and announcing an amicable divorce citing irreconcilable differences. They would protect my name. And fifth, the final turn of the screw, the most personal, the most painful. Genevieve Thorne would personally call 3 of her most influential, gossip-loving Charleston society friends, I had named them, and confess on speakerphone that the family was experiencing a severe financial crisis and that the Big Sur event was canceled due to their own gross mismanagement. And I would be on the line listening to every word. This wasn't about money. This was about destroying her social capital, the currency she valued above all else. The chapter ends there in that moment. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating my face. I watched the Thorne family huddled in their luxurious suite, broken and besieged, staring at a single sheet of paper that held the blueprint to their utter ruin. Their power was gone. Their legacy was in ashes. I saw them not as a family, but as a cornered pride of lions, magnificent and terrifying in their prime, now toothless and trapped. They had finally realized the gazelle they had been so casually hunting was a tiger in disguise. They had no choice but to surrender. And the cost would be their entire world. The dawn broke over Big Sur in fragile watercolor strokes of pink and gold. It was a beautiful, peaceful morning, the kind of morning that promises new beginnings. But inside the Cypress villa, it was the dawn of their ruin. There was no negotiation. There was no argument, just a single terse email sent at 5:17 a.m. from the Thorne family's lawyer to mine. They agreed to all terms, provide instructions. The process of their capitulation was as methodical and as brutal as a military occupation, and I orchestrated every moment of it remotely from my suite. I had a notary, a stoic woman named Miss Alvarez, drive up the winding coastal highway from Monterey. She was my emissary, the physical embodiment of the real world that had finally come to collect its due. The main event, the confessions. I insisted on witnessing via a live video call. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted them to see mine. My image was a cool, disembodied presence on the large television in their suite, my face serene, my expression unreadable. They were assembled on the couch opposite the screen, looking haggard and defeated in the harsh morning light. They looked like prisoners in their own gilded cage. Julian was first. He looked broken. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his face was pale and puffy, and his hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen. The document placed before him was a 2-page summary of his betrayal, the affair, the conspiracy, the lies. He refused to make eye contact with the camera. He just stared down at the paper as if it were his own death warrant, then signed his name in a jagged, almost illegible scrawl. Next was Alistair. He was different. There was no visible tremor in his hand. He read the document confessing to his own crimes, the hiding of assets, the plan to defame me, with the grim resignation of a pragmatist. He was a businessman who had been outmaneuvered, a king who had been checkmated. He understood the mechanics of defeat. He signed his name with a firm, steady stroke, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to the camera. It was not an apology. It was a concession of defeat from one power player to another. And then there was Genevieve. She was the last to sign, and it was the hardest for her. The notary placed the paper in front of her, and for a long moment she just stared at it, her whole body trembling with a silent, incandescent rage. She finally picked up the pen, her knuckles white. She looked up, then her eyes finding mine on the screen. They were not the eyes of a defeated woman. They were full of a pure, undiluted hatred that burned across the digital space between us. "You will regret this," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss. I leaned forward slightly in my chair, my own voice calm, and even a scalpel to her fury. "The time for regret was 5 years ago, Genevieve," I said. "All you have left now is consequences." Her face contorted, and with a strangled sob of rage, she slashed her signature across the bottom of the page. The next phase was the pinnacle of her humiliation. The phone calls. I watched as Alistair placed his cell phone on the coffee table in front of her and put it on speaker. "Now, Genevieve," I said, my voice still quiet. She glared at the screen. Then with a shaking finger she dialed the first number. I heard it ring. Then a bright, brittle female voice answered. "Genevieve, darling." What a surprise! Genevieve took a deep, shuddering breath. Her voice, usually so commanding, so full of aristocratic authority, was reduced to a strained, faltering whisper. "Bitsy, hello," she began. I am calling with some difficult news." "Oh my goodness, is everything all right?" Bitsy asked, her voice sharp with a sudden vulture-like curiosity. "No, Bitsy," Genevieve choked out the words, tasting like poison in her mouth. "No, it isn't. We, the Thorns, are experiencing a severe financial crisis." She paused, the silence stretching. "The birthday celebration here, in Big Sur, has been cancelled, due to our own mismanagement." I could hear the barely concealed gasp on the other end of the line, followed by a wave of insincere, gossipy sympathy. "Oh, Genevieve, you poor thing. I am so sorry to hear that. Is there anything at all I can do?" The news would be all over Charleston by lunchtime. The foundation of her social empire had just been reduced to rubble. She made 2 more calls, each one more painful, more humiliating than the last. While this theater of cruelty was playing out, my lawyer was working in the background, executing the financial agreements. The numbers were staggering a transfer of wealth that would change my life forever. But as I watched the confirmations ping into my inbox, I felt a strange detachment. The money was secondary. It was simply the tool, a symbol of my victory and the price of my security. It was Margot who finally broke. She had been sitting there silent and pale throughout the entire ordeal. But as Genevieve finished the final call, Margot crumpled, burying her face in her hands, her body racked with deep, gasping sobs. "You've destroyed us," she wailed at my image on the screen, her voice thick with tears and self-pity. "You've destroyed everything." I looked at her, this broken, shallow creature, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear certainty. "You were already destroyed, Margot," I said, my voice cutting through her sobs. "You were living in a house of cards built on lies. All I did was open a window and let the wind in." When the last document was signed, notarized, and the scanned copies were safely in my lawyer's digital possession, I ended the video call. The screen went black. The siege was over. I sent one final text message to the resort manager, Mr. Davies. "You can release the Thorns. Their bill has been settled." Then I began to methodically pack up my command center. I coiled the cables, wiped the hard drives, and packed the monitors back into their cases. I was an engineer cleaning up a work site. There was no triumph, no elation. Only the quiet satisfaction of a complex problem solved, a structure demolished safely and completely. I packed my own small bag, leaving the emerald green dress hanging in the closet. It had served its purpose. I walked out of the suite, leaving no trace that I had ever been there. I didn't look back. I walked down the stone path past the silent villas and out into the crisp, clean air of the Big Sur coast. I stood at the edge of the cliff and took a deep breath, the salt spray misting my face. It was the first breath I had taken in 5 years. As a truly free woman, I did not return to the Chicago apartment I had shared with Julian. That place was a museum of a dead marriage, and I had no interest in being its curator. Instead, my lawyer Lena had arranged for the rental of a sprawling, sun-drenched loft in a converted warehouse in the West Loop. It was a blank canvas white walls, polished concrete floors, and a wall of windows that looked out over the city. My new life began in an empty room. The war was over, but the shock waves were still traveling. I watched the aftermath from this safe, quiet distance, piecing together the wreckage of the Thorne dynasty from emails, news alerts, and the occasional hushed phone call. I was no longer an actor in the drama. I was an observer reading the post-mortem report of a world I had brought to its knees. The first tremor hit a week after I returned. It came in the form of a link in an email from Lena with a simple subject line, "It's begun." The link took me to the website of the Charleston Post and Courier. The headline was devastating in its quiet understatement, tarnished guilt, the secret history of the Thorne shipping fortune. The investigative reporter, the tenacious woman I had anonymously armed, had done her job magnificently. The article didn't explicitly use words like smuggling or opium. It didn't have to. It was a masterpiece of insinuation and documented fact. It spoke of irregular trade practices and morally ambiguous ventures that had mysteriously created the foundation of their wealth in the late 19th century. It referenced coded shipping manifests my ledgers and raised damning questions about the true nature of the cargo that had made the Thorne name synonymous with Charleston aristocracy. It didn't accuse them of being criminals. It simply presented the evidence and allowed the world to draw its own damning conclusion. Their carefully crafted image of aristocratic legitimacy was shattered not with a cannonball, but with 1,000 precise, well-placed cuts. The social fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Lena forwarded me emails from her Charleston contacts. The Thornes, once the untouchable center of their universe, had become pariahs in their own city. Invitations to galas and fundraisers mysteriously vanished. Alistair's membership at the exclusive St. Cecilia Society was, as one email put it, under quiet review. Genevieve, my sources said, had been asked to step down from the board of the Gibbes Museum of Art. The public statement about our amicable divorce, combined with the whispers from Genevieve's own forced phone calls, had created a perfect storm of rumor and disgrace. They were no longer just the subject of gossip. They were the subject of pity, which in their world was infinitely worse. Then came the predictable betrayal. I saw it on a high society blog, a statement released through a publicist. Blythe Kensington is deeply disappointed by recent events concerning the Thorne family, it read. Her focus remains on her philanthropic work with the Children's Hospital. She wishes all parties the best during this difficult time. I let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a masterwork of self-preservation. Blythe, the ultimate survivor, was publicly scrubbing her hands of the man she was supposed to spend her life with, distancing herself from the sinking ship before the water even touched her designer shoes. The affair that was meant to be her crowning social achievement had become a stain she was desperately trying to bleach away. The final contact from Julian came 2 weeks later, a single voicemail notification on my new unlisted phone number. He must have gotten it from one of the few mutual friends we still had. My first instinct was to delete it without listening, but I knew I had to hear it. To close the book. I pressed play. His voice was a ghost. It was weak rambling, thick with self-pity and whiskey. "Charlie," he began, his voice cracking. "Charlie, I don't even know what to say. Everything. It's all gone. My father, he doesn't speak. My mother just sits in the dark." He took a shaky breath. I know I messed up. I did. But I did love you, you know. At the beginning, I really did." His voice dropped to a pathetic whisper. "But they break everything they can't control, Charlotte. They always have. My mother, she breaks things." He was sobbing now. I was too weak. I should have warned you. I'm so sorry. I listened to the message once, and for a fleeting, dangerous moment I felt a flicker of pity for the weak, broken man on the other end of the line, the boy who was too afraid of his mother to become a man. But then I remembered. I remembered the cold, calculated cruelty of the script. I remembered the word malignancy. I remembered the vacant look in his eyes as he stood over the empty space where my chair should have been. And the pity evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard clarity that had become my shield. His weakness was not an excuse. It was a choice. A choice he had made every single day of our marriage. I held my finger over the screen, and with a final decisive tap, I deleted the message. I erased his voice from my life. The chapter ends with me here in my new office, the loft I purchased with cash from the settlement. The afternoon sun is streaming through the massive industrial windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The space is filled with the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. In front of me on a vast drafting table are the blueprints for a new concert hall in Austin, Texas. A space for creation, for beauty, for sound that lifts people up instead of tearing them down. My work is my sanctuary. It is my future. The noise from Charleston, the whispers, the accusations, the pathetic apologies. It has all faded into the background. Here in this quiet, sunlit room, I am finally in a space where the only sounds are the ones I choose to create. 1 year later. A year is a measurement of time, but for me, it was a measure of distance. The distance I had put between the woman I was and the woman I was becoming. My firm, now officially and legally reborn as Smith Acoustics, was more successful than I could have ever imagined. The story of my divorce, though never publicly detailed by me, had created a strange, unintended mystique in the architectural world. The whispers in the industry didn't paint me as a victim. They painted me as formidable, the quiet, self-made woman who had gone to war with an old money dynasty and won. The clients who came to me now for concert halls in Dubai, for theaters in London, for boardrooms in Tokyo, they saw me as not just brilliant, but resilient. I was in high demand. But the work that truly mattered, the work that began to heal the parts of me I thought were broken forever, was happening in a dusty, forgotten brick building in a rough neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. It was my passion project. A pro bono design for a music therapy center for underprivileged youth. Here, the science of acoustics wasn't about creating the perfect, pristine environment for a symphony orchestra. It was about creating a safe space, a room where a troubled teenager could sit at a drum kit and hammer out their rage and have it be absorbed by the walls, not judged. A vocal booth where a shy, withdrawn girl could sing her heart out, her voice amplified and made beautiful perhaps for the first time in her life. This project allowed me to use my skills not for the entertainment of the elite, but for healing, for community, and it brought me a level of quiet fulfillment, a profound rightness that designing for billionaires never could. That summer I took a trip that felt like traveling to another planet. I went home, back to Bend, Oregon. I stood on the shore of Sparks Lake, the snow-capped peaks of the Cascade Mountains reflected in the impossibly blue water, and I breathed in air so clean and crisp it felt like it was scrubbing my soul. My parents, a high school science teacher and a forest ranger, had never understood the world of the thorns. They were quiet, grounded people who measured wealth in sunsets and wildflowers. They didn't ask about the money or the divorce or the scandal. They just watched me. One evening, my father and I were sitting on the back porch, watching the sky turn a fiery orange behind the ponderosa pines. He was a man of few words, my dad. He just looked at me for a long time, his gaze steady and kind. "We were worried, you know," he said finally, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Worried you were losing yourself in all that shininess." He took a sip of his beer. "It's good to have you back, Charlie." And in that moment, that simple, honest affirmation, it meant more to me than every false compliment, every grudging approval the thorns had ever given me. It was a foundation, solid ground beneath my feet. The surprise encounter happened in the fall. I was at an architectural conference in Denver, navigating the beige, soulless convention center when I saw him. Alistair Thorne. He was standing alone by a sad-looking potted ficus, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. He looked diminished. The aura of power and authority he had once worn like a bespoke suit was gone. He was just an old man looking lost. He saw me, and his eyes widened in a flicker of panic. He seemed to consider turning away, but then, with a deep, resigned sigh, he walked toward me. "Charlotte," he said, his voice hesitant gravelly. "Alistair?" I replied, my own voice even betraying nothing. He didn't apologize, not directly. Men like Alistair don't know how. Instead, he just stared at a point over my shoulder. "Genevieve," he began, his voice dropping. "She's not well. The loss of her standing, it broke something in her. She doesn't go out." He swallowed hard. "I've sold the Charleston house. We're moving to a smaller place in Florida. To be anonymous." He finally met my eyes, and I saw a flicker of something ancient and weary in their depths. "You did what you had to do," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're a survivor." He paused, and then added the final cryptic piece, "like my great-grandmother." And then he just nodded and walked away, disappearing into the anonymous crowd. I stood there for a long time, the ficus my only witness, like my great-grandmother, the woman from the ledgers, the one who had built their fortune on grit and ruthlessness and morally ambiguous ventures. It was the closest he could ever come to admitting the truth of their family's origins, and to acknowledging my strength. He wasn't comparing me to the polished myth of Genevieve. He was comparing me to the survivor who had started it all. In that moment I understood. My revenge was so total, so devastating, because it was never just about money or humiliation. It was about forcing them to confront the unvarnished truth of who they were. I had held up a mirror, and the reflection had shattered them. The chapter ends here, tonight. I'm sitting across from a man in a small, noisy Italian restaurant in my Chicago neighborhood. His name is Ben. He's a landscape architect I met through the therapy center project. He's kind, he's funny with warm eyes and dirt under his fingernails that will never quite come clean. He's telling me a story about a disastrous battle with a gopher, and I'm laughing. A real laugh, a deep, easy sound that feels unfamiliar and wonderful. There are no pretenses, no hidden agendas. He is genuinely fascinated by the way I talk about sound waves, and I am genuinely fascinated by the way he talks about soil composition. It's easy, it's normal. And as he makes me laugh again, I feel a sense of lightness that I haven't felt in years. I'm no longer looking over my shoulder. I'm no longer listening for the whispers of a conspiracy. I am building a new life on a new foundation, one of my own making, one that is solid, true, and acoustically perfect. 2 years after Big Sur, 2 years of building, today is the grand opening of the Southside Music and Arts Center. The building is my design, but the sound belongs to them. I'm standing in the back of the main performance space, a room I engineered to have warm, forgiving acoustics. It's not a pristine symphony hall designed for perfect silence between notes. It's a room designed for noise, for the joy and the mess of creation. On the small stage, a group of teenagers who 6 months ago barely spoke to one another are playing a loud, gloriously messy rock song. The drummer, a boy who came to the center, consumed by a silent, simmering anger, is now channeling it into a powerful, life-affirming rhythm. The singer, a girl who used to hide behind her hair, is holding the microphone with a white-knuckled grip, her voice soaring with a confidence that is brand new. The sound isn't perfect. It's so much better than that. It's real. This is my true legacy. My true, not a name carved onto a university building, not a fortune sitting in a trust. It's this. The sound of children who have faced immense hardship, finding a release, finding a voice, finding joy. I find myself reflecting on the nature of power. The Thorns had power that was inherited, a fortress built on sand, propped up by whispers and reputation, and the fear they could inspire. My power, the power I used to dismantle them, was different. It was earned. It was built on intellect, on skill, and finally, on an unwavering belief in my own worth. In the end, my type of power, the kind you build from the inside out, proved more durable. I also think about the word revenge. When I was in my command center in Big Sur, it felt like revenge, a cold, sweet dish of it. But now, looking back from this distance, I see it as something else entirely. It was a radical act of self-preservation. It wasn't about hurting them. It was about saving myself. It was an amputation. A clean, precise, necessary severing of a diseased limb to save my own life. You don't apologize for an amputation. You just learn to live whole and healthy without the part that was killing you. A week ago, a package arrived at my office. It was a small, heavy box wrapped in plain brown paper with a return address in Palm Beach, Florida. The handwriting on the label was sharp, angry, and instantly recognizable. It was from Margot. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but curiosity, that old familiar friend, won out. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was one of the old leather-bound Thorn ledgers, and on top of it a single sheet of heavy cream stationery. The note was short. "Charlotte," it began, "I don't know why I'm sending you this. Maybe because you're the only one who ever saw it for what it was. Julian and Blythe are married. They live in a rented condo here in Palm Beach. He works in wealth management, which is a joke. He manages the dregs of her family's money. Mother doesn't leave the house. Father takes care of her. They're ghosts. You didn't just win, Charlotte. You set us free, in a strange way. Though I'll probably hate you forever for it. M." I read the note twice. I felt a strange, hollow echo of something that might have once been victory. I looked at the ledger in my hands, this heavy, dusty symbol of a corrupt dynasty, the source of their power and the blueprint of their downfall. I could have kept it, a trophy, a weapon to hold in reserve forever. But I was done with weapons. I was done with their secrets. That evening in my own apartment, my real home in Chicago, I built a fire in the hearth. I held the ledger for a long moment, feeling its weight. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I walked to the fireplace, and without a second thought, I tossed it into the flames. I watched as the dry, brittle pages curled, turning black at the edges. I watched as the spidery, elegant cursive, the record of their secret sins, was consumed by the fire. I watched as the secrets of the Thorn family turned to ash. And now the story concludes here. Tonight. I'm standing on the rooftop of my apartment building, the place Ben and I have started to call our own. The vast, glittering skyline of Chicago stretches out before me. The city is a living thing, a testament to human ingenuity, to things being built, to foundations that hold. I am no longer just an architect of spaces. I am the architect of my own life. The sound I hear now is not the oppressive, weaponized silence of the Thorn mansion or the hushed whispers of a conspiracy. It's the sound of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the L train, the faint sound of music drifting up from a bar down the street. It's the vibrant, chaotic, beautiful sound of a life being lived, a life I designed myself, a life lived with integrity, purpose, and absolute uncompromising freedom. The missing chair in Big Sur wasn't an empty space. It was the foundation for everything that came after. Looking back on it all now, it feels like studying an old blueprint. The lines are faded, the memories have softened, but the structure of the story, the foundation of what happened, remains crystal clear. The missing chair, the secret ledgers, the cold fury in that Big Sur suite, it all led me to where I am now. But the story isn't just about a marriage that ended or a family that fell. It's about what you choose to build when everything has been torn down. I learned a few things during my time as a Thorn, and even more during my time dismantling that life, and maybe they're lessons that can be applied to any life, not just one lived in gilded cages. First, I learned to listen to the silence. My entire career is based on the science of sound, but the most important lessons came from the silences in my own life. The silence in a car ride when there should be conversation. The silence after a backhanded compliment when your own voice gets caught in your throat. The silence of a partner who won't defend you. Those silences aren't empty. They are full of information. They are the acoustic warnings that the structure you're living in is fundamentally unsound. Learning to listen to that quiet, that's the first step to saving yourself. Second, your value is not a negotiation. The world, and sometimes the people who claim to love you most, will try to put a price tag on you. They'll try to define you by their own limited standards. They tried to tell me my life's work was a niche hobby, that my worth was conditional on my compliance. The most powerful thing I ever did was not canceling that dinner. It was the quiet decision long before that night that my worth was innate. It was non-negotiable. Your career, your passion, your integrity, that is your capital, never let anyone devalue it. And finally, I learned the difference between revenge and reclamation. What started as a cold, calculated act of revenge, it transformed into something else. It became an act of reclaiming my own narrative. It wasn't about destroying their future. It was about building my own. It was an amputation, yes, but it was also a groundbreaking. I had to clear away the poisoned earth before I could lay a new foundation, and that leads to what I believe is the most profound truth I discovered. The foundations of our lives are not built on the ground we are given, but on the ground we choose to stand upon after the earthquake. My story is what it is, and I own every part of it, the good and the bad. But I'm left wondering, was what I did truly revenge, or was it simply survival? And is there really a difference when you're pushed to the edge? Have you ever been in a situation where the silence told you more than words ever could? My story is just one story. Yours is happening right now. If this story made you think, or if it resonated with a silent battle of your own, I'd be honored if you'd share your thoughts in a comment. If you have a different opinion, if you believe there was another path I could have taken, please share that too. These conversations are how we all learn. And if you, like me, believe that stories are how we build stronger foundations in ourselves, then I hope you'll subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories yet to come. Thank you for listening.